The autumn air carried the earthy scent of decomposing leaves and the faint sweetness of wild persimmons as Sam Whitmore made his way through the familiar trails of the Blue Ridge Mountains. At 68, his weathered hands still held the gentle precision that had once comforted countless animals during his 40-year career as a veterinarian. Now, 3 years after Margaret's passing, these solitary walks through the North Carolina wilderness had become his meditation, his way of finding peace in a world that felt too quiet without her laughter echoing through their wooden cabin. Maple, his 7-year-old golden retriever, bounded ahead with the enthusiasm of a much younger dog, her feathery tail creating golden arcs against the backdrop of crimson and amber foliage. She had been Margaret's idea, a retirement gift that had arrived as a wriggling puppy just months before the cancer diagnosis. Now she was Sam's constant companion, the warm presence that kept the cabin from feeling like a mausoleum of memories. "Easy there, girl," Sam called softly as Maple disappeared behind a cluster of oak trees, her nose undoubtedly following some fascinating scent trail. He adjusted the wicker basket hanging from his arm, already containing a modest collection of oyster mushrooms and a few precious chanterelles. The forest had been generous today, and he looked forward to the simple pleasure of sautéing them with butter and herbs for dinner. The first sign that something was amiss came as a subtle disorientation, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the very air seems to hold its breath. Sam paused, one hand reaching instinctively for the sturdy trunk of a nearby maple tree. The sensation was peculiar, not quite dizziness, but rather as if the world had shifted slightly on its axis. His compass, clipped to his jacket, began spinning wildly, its needle unable to find true north. Around him, the forest erupted into chaos. A flock of crows burst from the canopy, their harsh cries filling the air as they wheeled in confused circles. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the distressed bellowing of deer, and even the industrious squirrels seemed to have abandoned their acorn gathering to chatter frantically in the treetops. Maple came racing back to his side, her ears flattened against her head, whimpering softly as she pressed against his legs. "What is it, girl?" Sam murmured, running his fingers through her thick coat. He had read about magnetic storms in his veterinary journals, rare phenomena that could disrupt the navigational systems of migrating animals. But he had never witnessed one firsthand, never felt the eerie wrongness that seemed to permeate the very air around them. As quickly as it had begun, the strange sensation passed. The compass needle steadied, pointing once again toward magnetic north. The forest sounds gradually returned to normal, though Sam noticed that many of the birds continued to call with an agitated urgency. Maple remained close to his side, her usual confident demeanor replaced by an uncharacteristic need for reassurance. They had been walking for another 10 minutes when Sam heard a sound so faint he almost dismissed it as the rustle of wind through dried leaves. But there it was again, a weak, mewling cry that tugged at his veterinarian's instincts. He stopped, tilting his head to listen more carefully. "Do you hear that, Maple?" he whispered. The dog's ears perked forward, and she began sniffing the air with renewed interest. The sound came again, definitely not the wind, but something small and alive and in distress. Following Maple's lead, Sam pushed through a thicket of mountain laurel until he reached a small clearing where a massive oak tree had fallen years ago, its trunk now serving as a nurse log for countless smaller plants. The crying seemed to be coming from beneath a pile of freshly fallen leaves that had accumulated against the log's base. Sam knelt carefully, his aging knees protesting against the uneven ground. With gentle hands, he began brushing away the layers of oak and maple leaves, following the sound that grew stronger with each handful he removed. He expected to find a baby bird, perhaps a fledgling that had fallen from its nest during the magnetic disturbance. What he uncovered instead made him rock back on his heels in astonishment. Two tiny black shapes, no larger than his palm, huddled together in a shallow depression beneath the log. For a moment, Sam thought they might be puppies. But as his eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the canopy, he realized what he was looking at: bear cubs. Newborn black bear cubs. Their eyes still closed, their fur barely more than dark fuzz covering their pink skin. "Oh my," Sam breathed, his veterinarian's training immediately taking over. The cubs were clearly in distress, cold, hungry, and far too young to be away from their mother. He looked around carefully, expecting to see the massive form of a protective sow somewhere nearby. Mother bears were notoriously dangerous when defending their young, and Sam had no desire to find himself between a confused bear and her babies. But the forest around them was quiet except for the normal sounds of afternoon wildlife. No heavy footfalls, no warning huffs or snorts. The magnetic storm, Sam realized, must have disoriented the mother bear, just as it had affected the other animals. In her confusion, she had likely wandered away from this old den, perhaps following a false direction while her cubs were sleeping. The cubs' cries were growing weaker, and Sam could see that they were beginning to suffer from exposure. The afternoon temperature was dropping as the sun moved lower in the sky, and these babies needed warmth and food soon, or they would not survive the night. Maple approached cautiously, her nose twitching as she investigated the unfamiliar scent. To Sam's surprise, she showed no fear or aggression toward the cubs. Instead, she whined softly and looked up at him with an expression he had learned to recognize over the years. The same look she gave him when she found an injured bird in the yard, or when she sensed his own sadness on difficult days. "I know, girl," Sam said quietly, gently scooping up the cubs and cradling them against his chest. They were surprisingly light, probably no more than a few weeks old. "We can't just leave them here." The decision was made in that moment, driven by the same compassion that had guided him through decades of veterinary practice. He knew the proper protocol would be to contact the wildlife authorities to let trained professionals handle the situation. But he also knew that by the time help arrived, these cubs would likely be dead from exposure and starvation. Sam carefully placed the cubs in his mushroom basket, using his jacket to create a warm nest around them. Maple walked close beside him as they made their way back toward the cabin, her protective instincts clearly activated by the presence of the helpless babies. The walk home seemed longer than usual, with Sam stopping frequently to check on his tiny passengers. By the time they reached the cabin, the cubs had quieted, whether from exhaustion or the warmth of his jacket, he couldn't tell. The familiar sight of the log structure with its wide porch and stone chimney had never looked more welcoming. Inside, Sam immediately set about creating a proper nest for the cubs. He lined a large cardboard box with soft towels and placed it near the fireplace where the warmth would help regulate their body temperature. The cubs stirred as he transferred them to their new bed, their tiny mouths opening in silent cries of hunger. "What am I going to feed you?" Sam mused aloud, his mind racing through the possibilities. Bear cubs this young would normally be nursing, receiving not only nutrition, but also the antibodies necessary for their survival. He had some experience with orphaned wildlife from his veterinary days, but nothing quite like this. Maple had positioned herself beside the box, her head resting on the edge as she watched the cubs with intense interest. When one of them began to cry, she whined softly in response, her maternal instincts clearly stirring. Despite never having had puppies of her own, Sam prepared a makeshift formula using warm milk, a beaten egg, and a small amount of honey, a combination he remembered from his early days treating orphaned animals. Using a small syringe, he carefully fed each cub, marveling at their tiny size and the strength of their suckling reflex. They were fighters, these little ones, and that gave him hope. As the evening wore on, Sam found himself sitting on the floor beside the box, watching the cubs sleep. They had instinctively curled together for warmth, their tiny bodies rising and falling with each breath. Maple had not moved from her position, maintaining her vigil like a devoted guardian. "What should we call you two?" Sam asked softly, reaching out to gently stroke their fuzzy heads. The cubs were identical in size and coloring, but he had already begun to notice subtle differences in their personalities. One seemed slightly more adventurous, lifting its head higher when he spoke. The other appeared more cautious, pressing closer to its sibling when disturbed. "How about Ash and Ember?" he suggested, thinking of the fireplace that would keep them warm through the coming nights. "You're both dark as coal, but there's fire in you yet." As if in response to their new names, the cubs stirred slightly, and Sam chose to take it as approval. Maple's tail gave a gentle thump against the floor. Sam reached over to scratch behind her ears. "Looks like we're a family now, girl," he said, his voice thick with emotion. For the first time since Margaret's death, the cabin didn't feel empty. It felt full of possibility, of new life and unexpected joy. The cubs' first night was restless, punctuated by frequent feedings and the constant need for warmth. Sam dozed fitfully in his recliner, waking every few hours to check on them. Maple never left her post, and Sam noticed that whenever the cubs cried, she would whine softly in response, as if trying to comfort them with her voice. By morning, both cubs were noticeably stronger, their cries were more vigorous, and they showed increased interest in their surroundings. When Sam approached with their morning feeding, Ash, the more adventurous one, actually tried to crawl toward the sound of his voice. "Well, look at that," Sam chuckled, gently picking up the cub. "You're already getting curious about the world, aren't you?" It was then that something remarkable happened. Maple, who had been watching the feeding process with intense interest, suddenly stood and approached Sam. She sniffed carefully at the cub in his hands, then with infinite gentleness, began to lick Ash's tiny head. The cub immediately quieted, leaning into the warm, rough tongue that cleaned and comforted him. "I'll be damned," Sam whispered, watching in amazement as Maple extended the same treatment to Ember. The dog seemed to understand instinctively that these were babies in need of care, and she was prepared to provide it. Over the following days, an extraordinary routine developed. Sam handled the feeding and medical care, drawing on his veterinary knowledge to ensure the cubs received proper nutrition and remained healthy. But it was Maple who truly became their foster mother, providing the constant warmth, comfort, and guidance that they needed to thrive. The dog's maternal instincts were remarkable to witness. When the cubs began to crawl more actively, exploring beyond their box, Maple would gently grasp them by the scruff of their necks, just as their real mother would have done, and carry them back to safety. She seemed to understand that they were too young to wander far, and she took her guardian duties seriously. As the cubs grew stronger and more active, Maple began what Sam came to think of as school. She would position herself in front of the cubs, who would sit attentively facing her, and demonstrate various behaviors. She showed them how to sit properly, how to lie down on command, and even how to lift a paw in a handshake gesture. The sight was both heartwarming and comical. Ash and Ember, now about the size of small puppies, would mimic Maple's actions with varying degrees of success. Their attempts at sitting were particularly amusing, as they would often topple over backward, their round bellies making balance challenging. Perhaps the most endearing was Maple's attempt to teach them to wag their tails. She would demonstrate enthusiastically, her golden plume sweeping back and forth, while the cubs watched with fascination. When they tried to copy her, their stubby bare tails could barely manage more than a wiggle, causing their entire rear ends to shake instead. The sight of two small bears sitting upright with their bottoms wiggling furiously never failed to make Sam laugh until tears ran down his cheeks. As spring arrived in the Blue Ridge Mountains, Ash and Ember had grown into sturdy, curious cubs about the size of small dogs. Their black fur had thickened and gained a healthy shine, and their eyes sparkled with intelligence and mischief. They had also developed distinct personalities that both delighted and occasionally exasperated Sam. Ash, true to his adventurous nature, was always the first to investigate new sounds or smells. He had learned to open cabinet doors by watching Maple, and he possessed an uncanny ability to find trouble even in the most child-proofed areas of the cabin. Ember, while more cautious, was actually the more clever of the two, often figuring out solutions to problems that left his brother stumped. Their education under Maple's tutelage had expanded beyond basic commands. The Golden Retriever had somehow taught them a complex system of cooperation that Sam found both impressive and alarming. It began with the Great Honey Incident, as Sam came to call it. He had been reading on the porch one warm afternoon when he heard a commotion from the direction of the old oak tree behind the cabin. Maple's urgent barking mixed with the distressed buzzing of what sounded like an entire army of bees. Sam rushed around the corner to find chaos in progress. Ash was clinging desperately to a branch about 10 feet up the oak, his fur standing on end as a cloud of angry bees swarmed around him. Below, Ember paced frantically while Maple barked instructions that neither cub seemed able to follow. The source of the conflict was obvious. A large beehive hung from a branch just above Ash's head, and honey dripped steadily from what appeared to be claw marks in its surface. "Ash, don't move," Sam called. But it was too late. The cub, panicked by the increasing number of bee stings, lost his grip and tumbled toward the ground. Maple, displaying the quick thinking that had made her such an exceptional companion, immediately positioned herself beneath the falling cub, breaking his fall with her own body. The impact sent both dog and cub rolling toward the small pond at the edge of the property. Without hesitation, Maple grabbed Ash by the scruff of his neck and plunged into the water, pulling him with her. Ember, seeing his brother in distress, followed immediately, and soon, all three animals were submerged in the pond while the frustrated bees circled overhead. When they finally emerged, Sam had to grip the porch railing to keep from falling down with laughter. Maple's usually elegant features were swollen from multiple bee stings, making her look like a canine version of a chipmunk storing nuts for winter. Her eyes were nearly swollen shut, and her muzzle had expanded to twice its normal size. Behind her, Ash and Ember trudged out of the pond, looking like two drowned rats, their normally fluffy fur plastered to their bodies. They moved with the peculiar gait of animals who had learned an important lesson about the relationship between actions and consequences. Ash bore several visible stings on his nose and ears, while Ember had apparently been smart enough to dive underwater at the first sign of trouble. "Well," Sam said, wiping tears of laughter from his eyes. "I guess we learned something about bees today, didn't we?" Maple, despite her swollen condition, managed to look distinctly reproachful. She had risked her own safety to save the cubs, and her expression clearly conveyed that she expected better judgment from her charges in the future. The incident led to what Sam began calling advanced education. Maple seemed to realize that the cubs needed more sophisticated guidance if they were going to survive their own curiosity. She began teaching them about teamwork. But unfortunately, the cubs applied these lessons in ways that would have made a professional thief proud. The first sign of their new skills came when Sam discovered that his refrigerator had been raided. He had secured it with a simple latch, assuming that would be sufficient to keep curious paws away from the food inside. He was wrong. Returning from a trip to town, Sam found the refrigerator door standing open and evidence of a systematic heist scattered across the kitchen floor. A package of sandwich meat had been opened and emptied, leaving only the plastic wrapper. A jar of his homemade honey had been knocked over, its contents creating a sticky trail that led from the refrigerator to the living room. The perpetrators were not difficult to identify. Maple lay on her bed by the fireplace, feigning sleep, but unable to hide the piece of ham hanging from the corner of her mouth. Ash and Ember were curled together on their favorite rug, their faces and paws sticky with honey, their expressions the picture of innocent slumber. "Really?" Sam said, hands on his hips. "You're going to pretend you're asleep?" 3 pairs of eyes opened simultaneously, and Sam was treated to the most elaborate display of fake yawning and stretching he had ever witnessed. Maple even managed a little whimper, as if she had been deeply disturbed by his arrival. "The evidence is all over your faces," Sam pointed out. But he was fighting back laughter. The sight of 3 animals trying to look innocent while covered in the remnants of their crime was too amusing to inspire real anger. Further investigation revealed the sophistication of their operation. Somehow they had figured out that by working together, they could overcome obstacles that would have stopped them individually. Maple, with her height and dexterity, could reach the refrigerator handle. The cubs, with their climbing abilities and smaller size, could access areas that Maple couldn't reach. The pattern became clear over the following weeks. The trio had developed a system of roles and responsibilities that would have impressed a team of professional burglars. Maple served as the lookout, positioning herself where she could see Sam approaching. Ash, the more agile climber, handled high-altitude work like reaching items on counters or shelves. Ember, the strategist, seemed to coordinate their efforts and devise solutions to security measures. Their masterpiece came on a day when Sam had been particularly proud of his latest batch of honey cake. He had placed it on top of the refrigerator, well out of reach of any normal domestic animal. He had even commented to Maple about how safe it was up there. He should have known better than to issue such a challenge. Sam was working in his small garden when he heard suspicious sounds from the kitchen. By the time he reached the back door, the operation was in full swing. Maple stood guard at the window, her ears perked for any sign of his approach. In the kitchen, Ash had positioned himself against the refrigerator, standing on his hind legs to provide a platform. Ember had climbed onto his brother's back and was reaching for the cake plate. The coordination was flawless. As Ember secured the cake, Ash carefully lowered himself to the ground, ensuring his brother's safe descent. They had even planned for cleanup. Maple immediately began licking honey from Ember's face while Ash worked on removing any evidence from the refrigerator surface. Sam watched in amazement as they prepared to divide their spoils. Ember, despite being the one who had risked the climb, carefully broke the cake into 3 equal portions. Each animal took their share to a different location, presumably to avoid competition during consumption. "I have to admit," Sam said, announcing his presence. That was impressive. The reaction was immediate and theatrical. All three animals instantly flopped to the ground, eyes closed, bodies limp, the very picture of innocent creatures taking an afternoon nap. The only problem was that they were still holding pieces of honey cake. Sam couldn't help himself. He burst into laughter, the sound echoing through the cabin and causing all three sleeping animals to crack open their eyes. The sight of them, Maple with her dignified expression undermined by cake crumbs on her nose, Ash and Ember with their round bellies and honey-sticky faces, filled him with a joy he hadn't felt since Margaret's passing. "You know what," he said, settling into his favorite chair. "Keep the cake. You earned it." As if understanding his words, the trio abandoned their pretense and settled down to enjoy their prize. But Sam noticed something that touched him deeply. Despite their successful heist, they had automatically arranged themselves in their usual circle with Maple in the center and the cubs on either side. Even in their mischief, they remained a family. The arrival of winter brought new challenges and deeper bonds. Sam had been concerned about the cubs' natural hibernation instincts, wondering if they would disappear into the forest when the cold weather arrived. Instead, Ash and Ember seemed to enter what he called half-hibernation. They slept more than usual, sometimes for 12 or 14 hours at a stretch, but they always woke up ready to play and interact with their adopted family. Maple adapted her own schedule to match theirs, spending the long winter afternoons curled up with the cubs by the fireplace. Sam often found all three of them arranged in a pile, with Maple's golden fur contrasting beautifully with the cubs' black coats. The sight never failed to warm his heart and remind him that family could take many forms. It was during one of the coldest nights of winter that their bond was tested in a way none of them could have anticipated. Sam had been feeling unwell for several days, his chest tight and his breathing labored. He attributed it to the cold weather and his advancing age. But as the night wore on, his condition worsened. The old cabin's heating system had been acting up, and sometime around midnight, the furnace finally gave up entirely. Sam woke to find the temperature dropping rapidly, his breath visible in the frigid air. He tried to restart the system, but his mechanical skills were limited and the cold was making his breathing even more difficult. As his condition deteriorated, Sam realized he was in serious trouble. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the phone lines were down due to the storm. He could feel his chest tightening, the familiar signs of an asthma attack combining with the early stages of hypothermia. It was Maple who first recognized the severity of the situation. The dog had been trained as a young animal to recognize medical emergencies, a skill Sam had taught her after Margaret's first heart episode. She approached Sam as he struggled to breathe, whining softly and pawing at his arm. "I'm okay, girl," Sam tried to say, but his voice was barely a whisper. Maple was not convinced. She began pacing frantically, her distress obvious to both Sam and the cubs, who had woken from their deep sleep. What happened next would later be called miraculous by the rescue workers, but Sam knew it was simply the result of love and intelligence working together. Maple, understanding that Sam needed help, made a decision that probably saved his life. She went to the door and began barking urgently, looking back at Sam as if asking permission. "Go." Sam managed to whisper, understanding what she intended. "Go get help." Maple hesitated for just a moment, clearly torn between leaving Sam and getting the help he needed. Then she nuzzled his hand once and disappeared into the storm. As soon as Maple left, Ash and Ember moved into action. Their behavior was purely instinctual, but it was exactly what Sam needed. The cubs positioned themselves on either side of his body, pressing their warm fur against him and sharing their body heat. They seemed to understand that he was in danger, and they were determined to keep him alive until help arrived. The night passed in a blur of cold and pain, but Sam was never alone. Ash and Ember maintained their vigil, occasionally shifting position to ensure maximum warmth transfer. When Sam's breathing became particularly labored, they would press closer, their steady heartbeats providing comfort and reassurance. Meanwhile, Maple was undertaking an epic journey through the storm. The dog had to travel nearly 10 miles through deep snow and dangerous conditions to reach the nearest neighbor. Her thick coat provided some protection, but the journey was treacherous, requiring her to navigate fallen trees and drifts that were taller than she was. When she finally reached the Henderson farm, Maple was exhausted but determined. She barked frantically at their door, refusing to be calmed until they understood that something was wrong. Jim Henderson, who knew Sam and had met Maple several times, recognized immediately that the dog was trying to communicate an emergency. "Something's wrong with Sam," he told his wife, reaching for his phone to call the emergency services. Maple wouldn't leave him unless it was serious. The rescue team that responded included paramedics, firefighters, and a search and rescue coordinator who had experience with mountain emergencies. They followed Maple back through the storm, the dog leading them unerringly through the darkness despite her exhaustion. When they reached the cabin, they found a scene that none of them would ever forget. Sam was unconscious but alive, his body temperature dangerously low but stable. On either side of him, Ash and Ember maintained their protective positions, their eyes alert and wary as strangers entered their home. "I'll be damned," whispered one of the paramedics. "Those bears kept him alive." The rescue was complicated by the presence of the cubs, who were reluctant to leave Sam's side even when the paramedics needed to work. It was Maple, despite her exhaustion, who finally convinced them to move back. She positioned herself between the cubs and the rescue workers, communicating through body language that these humans were there to help. As the paramedics worked to stabilize Sam and prepare him for transport, one of the firefighters began recording the scene with his phone. The footage would later go viral, showing the remarkable bond between the elderly man and his unusual family. The video captured Maple's exhausted but determined expression as she watched over both Sam and the cubs, and the gentle way Ash and Ember stayed close enough to help but far enough away to let the professionals work. Sam spent 3 days in the hospital, recovering from hypothermia and pneumonia. The entire time he worried about his animals, knowing that Maple would be caring for the cubs, but concerned about their emotional state. When he finally returned home, he was greeted by a celebration that brought tears to his eyes. All 3 animals had positioned themselves on the porch, waiting for his arrival. Maple's tail created a golden blur as she wagged it with joy, while Ash and Ember performed their amusing version of the same gesture, their entire rear ends wiggling with excitement. The reunion was emotional and chaotic, with all 3 animals trying to welcome him home simultaneously. The story of the rescue had indeed gone viral, as the firefighters' video was shared millions of times under the title, "Dog and Bears Save Elderly Man, Love Without Borders." News crews arrived from as far away as Atlanta, wanting to interview Sam and document the unusual family. Sam, who had always been a private person, was overwhelmed by the attention but touched by the positive response. The media coverage brought visitors from around the world, people who wanted to see the famous bear family for themselves. Sam was initially concerned about the disruption to their quiet life, but he soon realized that their story was providing something important to people, hope and evidence that love could transcend the boundaries that usually separated species. Ash and Ember, now nearly full-grown, seemed to enjoy the attention. They had learned to pose for photographs, sitting upright with Maple between them like proud parents with their children. Their old tricks, the attempted tail wagging, the synchronized handshakes, the elaborate pretense of innocence when caught in mischief, delighted visitors and provided endless entertainment. But it was the quiet moments that meant the most to Sam. In the evenings, when the visitors had gone and the cameras were put away, the four of them would settle into their familiar routine. Sam would read by the fireplace while Maple dozed at his feet, and Ash and Ember played gentle games that never quite escalated into real roughhousing. As the years passed, the cubs grew into magnificent adult bears, their black coats glossy and their builds powerful. They were fully capable of surviving in the wild, and Sam often wondered if they would eventually choose to leave. But every evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, they would return to the cabin, choosing family over freedom. The sight never failed to move him, two massive black bears approaching the porch with the same gentle demeanor they had shown as cubs, their eyes bright with intelligence and affection. They had never been tamed in the traditional sense, they had simply chosen to stay because this was where they belonged. Maple, now showing her age with gray around her muzzle and a slightly slower gait, remained the undisputed leader of their unusual pack. The bears, despite their size and strength, still deferred to her judgment and sought her approval for their actions. She had taught them well, and they had never forgotten their lessons. On quiet evenings, Sam would sit on his porch and watch his family interact. Maple would still occasionally demonstrate proper behavior for the bears, though her lessons now focused more on social skills than basic survival. Ash and Ember would practice their handshakes and sit commands, not because they had to, but because it seemed to please both Maple and Sam. The games of fetch had evolved into something uniquely their own. When Sam threw a stick, the bears would indeed chase it, but they had never quite grasped the concept of bringing back the same object. Instead, they would return with whatever had caught their interest, sometimes a different stick, sometimes a rock, occasionally a piece of Sam's laundry that had been hanging on the line. Sam had learned to appreciate the creativity of their interpretations. The thieving alliance had also evolved, becoming more sophisticated and, thankfully, less destructive. The trio had learned to open containers and cabinets with remarkable skill, but they had also learned moderation. They would take what they needed for a snack, but they no longer emptied entire packages.